There is a small stone sitting on top of pump number 2 at the Briggs service station on Route 66 in Tucumcari, New Mexico. Nobody put it there on purpose. It is just a piece of gravel, the kind that gets caught in the tread of a tire and drops onto the apron without anyone noticing. But on the morning of September 18th, 1959, a man in a tan Stetson picked that stone up from the ground and used it to hold down a $5 bill on top of the pump, so the wind would not carry the bill away before the right man could take it. Nora Whitfield, standing on the porch of her diner across Route 66 with a coffee pot in her hand, watched him do it. She watched him do a lot of things that morning, and 40 years later, when people asked her about September 18th, 1959, she always started with the stone, not with the Buick from the bank, not with the padlock, not with the tall man in the Stetson. She started with the stone because she said that was the moment she understood something was different about that day, though she could not have told you what. To understand why that stone matters, you need to go back 25 years. You need to go back to the winter of 1934, to a piece of flat, hard ground on the south side of Route 66, at the eastern edge of Tucumcari, New Mexico, where a man named Gerald Briggs was digging a foundation by hand in December. Gerald Briggs had worked as a track walker for the Santa Fe Railroad for 14 years. A track walker's job is simple and brutal. You walk the line, you look for damage, you report what you find. You do it in every kind of weather this country knows how to produce, and the high desert of New Mexico knows how to produce most of them. Gerald did it for 14 years without missing a shift, and saved almost every dollar he made because he had a plan, and because he believed that a plan was only as good as the patience behind it. By the winter of 1934, he had enough. He bought the land in November and started digging in December. The ground was cold but not frozen, which was the only good thing he could say about it. He did not rent equipment because renting equipment cost money, and he had figured exactly what he needed to spend, and there was no room in those numbers for equipment rental. He dug with a spade he had carried since 1921, and he did it alone, working from first light until he could not see anymore, then walking back to the boarding house on 2nd Street, where he rented a room for $6 a week. Nora Whitfield was 19 years old that winter, the daughter of the man who ran the diner on the north side of Route 66. Her father was Bill Whitfield, a short and careful man who had kept the diner open through the Depression by cutting every cost he could think of and still serving food that a person actually wanted to eat. Nora watched Gerald Briggs dig that foundation every morning from the diner window. Her mother started sending her across the road with a cup of coffee at 7 o'clock each day. Nora would hand the cup to Gerald, and he would take it without stopping moving and without saying thank you. And she thought at first that this was rudeness until she understood that he was not ignoring her. He was just somewhere else. He was inside the plan, and the plan had no room in it for pausing. Gerald Briggs nailed the sign above the front door himself, in the spring of 1935. It said, Briggs and Son established 1934. His son Roy was 7 years old at the time. Gerald painted the word son onto that sign when his boy was 7 years old, which means he was not building a gas station. He was building something that would still be standing when he was not. That is a different kind of work. That is the kind of work that looks like stubbornness from the outside, but is actually something much harder to name. Roy Briggs grew up in that station the way other boys grew up on ranches or in stores. He knew the smell of motor oil before he knew how to multiply. He knew the sound of a carburetor that was not drawing right before he knew how to read a map. By the time he was 12, he could change the oil on a passenger car faster than most grown men, and by 15 he was doing transmission work that Gerald trusted him to finish without supervision. The year Roy turned 15, Gerald gave him the only mechanical lesson that stayed with him for the rest of his life. They were working on a Ford flathead that a trucker had brought in off the highway, and Roy was trying to force a bolt that did not want to move. He was gripping the wrench the way a boy grips a wrench white-knuckled, pushing with everything he had. Gerald watched him for a moment and then said quietly without stopping his own work, "Loosen your hand." Roy looked at him. Gerald said it again. "Loosen your hand. Hold it in the last 3 fingers and let the first 2 ride free." Roy did it. The bolt came loose on the next pull. Gerald said, "When you squeeze too hard, you are fighting the tool. When you relax, the tool does the work for you. That is how all of this works, not just the wrench." Roy carried that in his hands every day for the next 37 years. And one day, without planning to, he would pass it to someone else. Before he died in the summer of 1948, Gerald Briggs left one more thing. Roy found it a week after the funeral when he was searching the desk drawer for a pen. Under a stack of invoices and a road map of New Mexico lay a small wooden mallet and a folded piece of paper. The note said, "When the bank has no more paper on this station, take this mallet up to the sign and drive the nail in the top left corner all the way home. I only tacked it in 1934 because you were too small to hold the mallet. By the time you read this, you will be big enough. You will understand what I mean when you do it." Roy put the mallet back in the drawer. He folded the note and placed it underneath the mallet. And there they stayed through every season that followed, waiting for the morning when Roy Briggs would finally be able to pick them up. Gerald died of a heart attack in August of 1948. He was sitting in the chair behind the counter in the station office, and by the time anyone found him, the coffee in his cup had been cold for 2 hours. He was 61 years old. Roy was 21. He opened the station at 6 o'clock the following morning. This was not courage. It was what the morning required, and Roy had learned from Gerald that the morning always required the same thing. The station paid for itself through the Korean War years, through the long, slow winters when the snow came sideways off the Llano Estacado, and the highway went quiet for weeks at a time through the year. Roy met Ruth Calloway at a church social in 1950 and married her 6 months later. And through the years that came after, when it began to seem like things were going to be all right, Danny Briggs was born in March of 1952, and he came into the world making noise, which was something Roy always thought was a good sign in a person. By the time Danny was walking, he was already in the station, sitting on the concrete floor of the second bay. With a wrench he was too small to use, turning it over and over in his hands the way his father turned them over, learning the weight of metal before he knew the names of the things it was attached to. In the spring of that same year, 1952, Roy walked into the First National Bank of Holbrook and sat down across a desk from a man named Arthur Fleming. Fleming was 35 years old and had just been promoted to assistant manager. He was not a cruel man. He was a careful one, and careful men who work at banks have a way of looking at numbers on a page that makes the numbers more real to them than the people the numbers represent. Fleming looked at Roy's financial disclosure for a long moment and then said in the tone of a man delivering weather information, "Mr. Briggs, with your current income, I'm going to need additional collateral. The loan extension requires it." Roy looked at the desk between them. He had the station, which was already the collateral. He had a truck with 2 years of payments left on it. He had $32 in a savings account he had started for Danny's future and had not touched since the day he opened it. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and put Danny's birth certificate on the desk. He said, "I don't have any other assets, but I have a reason." Fleming picked up the birth certificate. He read it. He set it down. He pulled Roy's file toward him and signed his name at the bottom of the extension form without saying anything else. That was the only time Arthur Fleming and Roy Briggs looked each other in the eye. and both of them knew exactly what the moment meant. Neither of them forgot it, though they would not speak of it for 11 years. Ruth got sick in 1955. By 1956, the doctor visits had turned into hospital stays, and by 1957, the hospital stays were longer than the time between them. Roy paid the bills the way his father had built the station, one envelope at a time with whatever the pumps and the repair bays produced. Ruth died in February of 1957. She was 29 years old. Danny was 4. Roy opened the station the following Monday. By 1959, Roy Briggs was 52 years old and had been running that station alone for 11 years. He had a burn scar on his right forearm from a transmission fire in 1951. A stripe of skin a shade lighter than the rest, about 3 inches long just below the inside of his elbow. His hair had gone gray at the temples in his mid-40s and was mostly gray now. His hands were the hands of a man who had held tools in them since 1940, brought across the knuckles with calluses that had built up and cracked and built up again so many times that the skin there no longer looked quite like skin, but like something more durable than that. Danny was 20 years old in the spring of 1959. He had been admitted to New Mexico State University in Las Cruces the previous fall to study mechanical engineering. Tuition was $150 a semester. Room and board was another $70. Roy had been covering it from the pumps the same way he covered everything else. In April of 1959, a man named Walt Greer drove his company car to the station and parked on the apron without pulling up to either pump. Greer was 44 years old and worked as a regional representative for Phillips 66. He wore a gray suit that was too good for Tucumcari and shoes that had not picked up a single piece of gravel from the apron, even though he had walked across it. He set an envelope on the counter without extending his hand. He said effective May 1st wholesale pricing increases 40% for all independent dealers east of Albuquerque. You have 30 days to sign a new contract or find another supplier. Roy said, why? Greer said, company decision. Roy said, I need to look at the numbers. Greer picked up his hat and walked back to his car and drove away. And that was the last Roy saw of him for 8 months. 2 days after Greer left, Pete Saunders came by. Saunders ran the mobile station 3 miles east on Route 66. He had rebuilt his place in 1957 with a bank loan that had bought him 2 new service bays and a canopy over the pumps, and he was proud of it the way a man gets proud of something he has borrowed money to create. He stood on Roy's apron with his hands in his pockets and said that he had already signed the new Phillips contract and that Roy ought to do the same. He said, Roy, this is the future. You're either going with it or you're getting left behind. Roy looked out at the road for a moment. Then he said, Pete, I need to think about it. Saunders nodded and drove away. Roy stood there knowing that what Pete had said was true for Pete because Pete had a bank behind him, and that it was not true for Roy because Roy did not. The 40% increase would eat every dollar the pumps made above operating costs, and then some. There was no slack in the line anywhere. May came. Roy missed his first mortgage payment to First National Bank of Holbrook. He called the branch and told them he would catch up in June. He did not catch up in June. In July, he sold his personal truck and used the money to cover 2 weeks of fuel costs. In August, a letter came from Holbrook on bank letterhead. Final notice. Debt acceleration. All amounts due and payable. Roy read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer beside Gerald's mallet, because it seemed like the right place for things that were too important to throw away and too heavy to look at every day. On the evening of September 17th, Roy sat at the desk after the station closed and wrote a letter to First National Bank of Holbrook. He addressed it to Arthur Fleming. He wrote that he understood the situation and was not asking for the full amount to be forgiven. He was asking for 8 more days. Danny was going back to school on September 26th. After Danny left, Roy had arranged to work evenings at Nora Whitfield's diner 3 nights a week. With the diner income combined with the pumps, he calculated he could make the first payment within 10 days of Danny's departure, and he committed to that in writing. He signed the letter with his full name and mailed it from the post office on Cedar Street at 8:15 that evening. He did not know when he sealed that envelope that Arthur Fleming would receive it the following morning. He did not know that Fleming would read it at his desk in Holbrook, fold it, and place it inside Roy's file. He did not know that the pressure from the Home Office to close this account before the fourth quarter had been building for 6 weeks, and that Fleming had been told in direct terms by his supervisor that this property needed to be resolved by end of September. He did not know any of that. He sent the letter because it was the right thing to do, and because there was still a part of him that believed the right thing done clearly and honestly had a chance of mattering. He was at the station at 6 o'clock the next morning. Opening the station was not a decision Roy made on September 18th, 1959. It was not an act of courage. It was what the morning required. He pulled the padlock off the front door and turned the sign from closed to open, and started the coffee and turned on the radio in the office window. Patsy Cline was playing. She was often playing. Danny came through the back of the office at 7:15, with grease already on his forearm from something he had started before Roy arrived. He poured coffee into the cup Roy kept on the shelf above the radio and said without looking up that the Ford pickup in the second bay was going to be finished by early afternoon. He said he could be back at school by the time it got dark. Roy said, "Good. Get it done before 3. Danny looked at him for a moment. Then he took his coffee and went back into the second bay. There were things Danny Briggs wanted to say to his father that morning and could not find the opening for. He had known for weeks that something was wrong, not because Roy had told him, but because Roy had not told him. And Roy not telling him something was the loudest kind of signal there was. Danny had learned not to push. You learned that early living with Roy Briggs. You learned to read what was in the quiet, rather than waiting for something to be said out loud. So Danny went back to the Ford and picked up his wrench and tightened a bolt that didn't need tightening. And his hands moved because his hands understood that sometimes you keep working not because there is work to do, but because stopping is worse. At 7:30, Nora Whitfield came across Route 66 with a thermos and 2 cups. She had been doing this every Friday morning since the winter after Ruth died, when she decided that Roy Briggs was the kind of man who would drink bad coffee alone forever. If someone did not come with better coffee and sit with him for 20 minutes, Roy never asked her to do it and never thanked her for it. But he was always there when she arrived. She sat on the bench beside the office door that morning and poured and did not say much. There was a quality to the light on that stretch of Route 66 in September, a thin, bright clarity that came from the elevation and the dry air that made everything look more sharply itself than usual. Roy did not notice it because Roy was watching the road. At 11:47, a red pickup truck pulled onto the apron from the highway. It was an older model with the kind of road dust that accumulates over several hundred miles and not one recent wash. The man who stepped out wore a tan Stetson and a faded denim work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the middle of his forearms. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, moving with the deliberate ease of a man who had been driving for a long time and had stiffened up but was not going to show it. He pulled the nozzle from pump number 2 and inserted it into the truck's tank. Then he stopped. He did not squeeze the handle. He just stood there with his hand around the nozzle and looked at the office. Nora Whitfield, back at the diner now with a clear view across the road, saw this. She said later that he did not look like a man waiting to pay. He looked like a man reading something from a distance, reading the face of a person behind glass, and not yet decided about what the reading meant. Roy could see the man at pump 2 through the window. He registered him the way he registered everyone who stopped. Approximate age, approximate type look of the vehicle. He did not put a name to the man, because Roy Briggs did not assign names to men in Stetsons and denim, just because they were wearing Stetsons and denim. Half the ranchers between Tucumcari and the Arizona line dressed exactly that way. The man stood at pump number 2 for 20 minutes without pumping gas. At noon, Arthur Fleming's car appeared from the east. A black Buick, a 1958, new enough that the chrome still picked up light cleanly. Behind it came the Key County Sheriff's vehicle. Sheriff Dale Horn had been the county sheriff for 22 years. He was 60 years old, a man of medium build who had spent 2 decades developing the particular posture of someone who has had to deliver bad news in a professional capacity more times than he could count. He had a padlock on the passenger seat. Fleming parked at the first pump. He got out without looking at Roy through the window first. He came into the office with a folder under his arm and set it on the counter and opened it without extending his hand. Then he read from a typed page in the voice of a man reading from a typed page, which is a particular kind of voice that takes all the feeling out of language and leaves only the information. Notice of foreclosure. Briggs Service Station, Tucumcari, New Mexico. All operations to cease at 12:05 p.m. on this date. Property reverts to First National Bank of Holbrook, pending sale. He had read that paragraph across 31 properties in 4 counties. His voice did not change, but at the words pending sale, something happened. His voice stopped for a fraction of a second, less than a full beat. The way a voice stops when a man has read something he already knew was coming, and finds that knowing it was coming did not prepare him for the sound of the words out loud. Sheriff Dale Horn was standing in the office doorway with the padlock in his right hand, and he heard that pause. He had worked alongside Fleming on 18 of these proceedings, and he had never heard that pause before. He looked at Fleming. Fleming did not look back at him. He continued reading. Roy came out from behind the counter when Fleming finished. He said, 8 more days. You received my letter this morning. Danny goes back to school on the 26th. Let me work 1 more week. Fleming closed the folder. He said 12:05. Then he turned and walked out toward the Buick. Horn moved to step aside and then stopped and said quietly, too quietly for anyone outside the door to hear Art, the letter. Fleming did not slow down. He said, I know. He kept walking. Horn stood in the doorway with the padlock shifting from one hand to the other. 22 years. 31 properties. He had done his job at every one of them because the law was the law, and a man either respected that or he did not. But standing there now, listening to Fleming say, I know, and keep walking, Horn felt something he had not expected to feel at 60 years old. He felt that there was a difference between the law and what was right, and that he had spent a very long time telling himself they were the same thing. Danny came out of the second bay when he heard the cars on the gravel. He was standing at the bay opening now with the wrench still in his hand, taking in the black Buick, the county vehicle, the folder on the counter, and his father's face. He walked to the counter and set the wrench down on the edge of it, very carefully, the way you set something down, when you are afraid that if you put it down hard, you will not be able to stop. He said, Pop. Roy looked down at his hands flat on the wood of the counter. Danny said, Pop, what do we do? Roy said, you go back to school. I will figure it. His voice was level. It was level because he had said those words to himself every night for 4 months, turning them over until they had worn smooth enough to come out of his mouth without catching. He had practiced saying them until they sounded like something a man says when he has a plan, even though what they really were was the one thing he knew he was not allowed to stop believing. Danny stood there for a long second. He looked at his father's hands on the counter. He looked at the padlock in Horn's hand. Then he turned and walked out through the bay door into the white September light. He stopped beside the empty grease pit and stood with his back to the office and looked east toward the long, straight road that ran all the way to Amarillo. At pump number 2, the man in the tan Stetson reached down and picked up a small stone from the gravel of the apron. He set it on top of the pump. He placed a $5 bill beneath it. Then he straightened up and he began to walk across the apron toward the office door, unhurried, looking at nothing except the door. Sheriff Dale Horn had put a padlock on 31 properties in 22 years. He knew the precise weight of the one in his hand. He knew the sound a hasp makes when it closes and the particular silence that follows it. And he had trained himself over 2 decades to stand inside that silence without letting it settle into him. He had done it so many times that he had stopped thinking of it as something he was doing to people and had started thinking of it as something that happened to property, a legal and administrative function that had nothing to do with the men and women standing on the other side of the door. He was still holding that belief when the man at pump number 2 lifted his hand off the nozzle and began walking across the apron. Horn saw him coming from the office doorway. He had registered the man earlier the same way he registered anyone at the pumps, as background, as neutral detail that was not part of the proceeding. But something about the way the man moved across the gravel changed that. He was not hurrying. He was not performing. He was walking the way a man walks when he has made a decision. And the decision is already past the point of being revisited when all that remains is the distance between where he is and where he needs to be. Horn stepped aside before he knew he was going to. From across Route 66, Nora Whitfield watched from the diner porch. She had watched the Buick arrive. She had watched Fleming go in with the folder. She had watched Roy through the office window, the shape of him behind the glass. And she had known from the set of his shoulders what was being read aloud. She had been watching Roy Briggs' shoulders for 12 years, and she knew every posture they were capable of. She had refilled her coffee 3 times without drinking any of it. Now she watched the tall man in the Stetson walk toward the office, and she put the coffee pot down on the rail and stood very still. Danny Briggs was standing at the grease pit with his back to everything when he heard the footsteps on the gravel change. 2 sets had come from the Buick and the county car. This was a 3rd set, and they were moving differently. He did not turn around yet. He kept his eyes on the long eastward run of Route 66 and listened. The man stopped at the office door. He said, "Mr. Briggs." Roy looked up. 11 years behind that counter, Roy Briggs had looked up from paperwork at hundreds of men who looked more or less like this one. Denim work shirts with the sleeves rolled. Stetsons worn with the crown creased straight, rather than shaped the way working men wore them, rather than the way men who wanted to look like working men wore them. He looked at the face the same way he looked at all of them, taking in what was there, without adding anything that was not. A man in his early 50s. High cheekbones, eyes that had been watching things from a distance for a long time and had settled into a particular quality of stillness because of it. Roy said, $5 on pump 2. Go ahead and take it. The man reached into his shirt pocket and set a second bill on the counter next to Roy's coffee cup. He said, for the next fellow when he comes through. Roy looked at the bill. He looked at the man. He said, the station is closing in 2 minutes. The man said, I heard. He did not move. He stood in the doorway with his hat low and his hands loose at his sides and looked at Roy the way a man looks at something he is trying to read, without the benefit of context, taking the information straight and deciding later what to do with it. Roy said, there is nothing I can do for you today. I am sorry for the trouble. The man said, where are you watching from? Come on and tell me in the comments. I want to know how far this story reaches. Roy reached over and turned the radio off. The silence came in fast, the way silence does after music. And for a moment, the only sounds in the office were the distant idle of Fleming's Buick engine and the dry wind moving through the pump canopy. The man said how much. Roy blinked. The man said how much to keep the doors open. Roy looked at him for a long moment. He had spent 4 months with the number in his head, turning it over at the kitchen table at night, after the station closed, writing it on scratch paper and tearing the paper up, seeing it on the final notice from Holbrook, in the particular typeface of a document designed to end things. He had said it to himself so many times that it had stopped sounding like money and started sounding like a verdict. But he had not said it out loud to another person. Not once, in 4 months. And the reason he had not said it out loud was the same reason a man does not say out loud the thing he has already accepted. You do not negotiate with an outcome you have finished grieving. The question this man was asking required him to say the number as though it were still a live amount, as though it still had the power to open or close something. And Roy found standing behind the counter with the foreclosure notice on the wood in front of him, and his coffee gone cold at his elbow, that this was the thing he was most afraid of, not the loss of the station. He had been losing the station for months, and had arrived somewhere on the far side of that particular fear. What he was afraid of was hope. Hope was the thing that could still hurt him. He said $2,300 even. 6 months back mortgage and the August fuel bill from Phillips. That is the number. He said it the way a man says the number, when he has already decided the number does not matter. And as he said it, he heard it differently than he had ever heard it in his head. Said out loud in the air of the office to a man who was standing there and listening, it sounded smaller. Not easier, but smaller in the way that some things shrink when they are finally named. The man nodded once. Then he turned and walked back out across the apron toward the Buick. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you something about who was standing in that office doorway. Because that story did not come out of nowhere. It came from a man who understood something about the weight of a number said out loud in a room where the doors were closing. In September of 1959, John Wayne was 52 years old. He had been famous since 1939, which meant he had been famous for 20 years, long enough for the public version of him to have entirely replaced the private one in most people's minds. What people knew was the screen. What they did not know was the man who had spent the previous 18 months pouring his own money into a film called The Alamo, a production that had gone over budget and was still not finished, a project that had cost him more than he had and more than he had borrowed, and was now costing him sleep, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from having your financial future attached to a single uncertain outcome. He had been driving alone from Tucson to Los Angeles on no particular schedule. This was something he did when the production pressure reached a certain level. He drove alone on long roads and did not talk to anyone and let the distance do what distance does to perspective. He had pulled into Tucumcari on Route 66 because the fuel gauge said he needed to, and because the Briggs station was the first one he saw. He had pulled the nozzle from pump 2 and looked through the office window at the man inside, and seen something in the way Roy Briggs was sitting at his counter that stopped him. Roy was not moving. He was not doing paperwork. He was sitting at his desk, with his hands flat on the surface the way a man sits when he has finished expecting anything. Wayne had seen that posture before on a man sitting at a kitchen table in the fall of 1929. The week before the market took everything, his father had sat exactly that way for 7 days. Wayne had been 22 years old and had not understood what he was looking at until it was too late to do anything about it. He had been standing at pump 2 for 20 minutes when the Buick arrived. He had not pumped any gas. Now he crossed the apron toward Fleming's car. He did not knock on the driver's window. He stood next to it and waited. Fleming had the engine running and the window up. He sat behind the glass with the folder on the passenger seat and his hands on the steering wheel looking forward, doing the thing that men do in cars when they want to seem unavailable. After 8 seconds, he rolled the window down 2 inches. Wayne said, "You are foreclosing on this man for $2,300. Fleming said, "Sir, this is bank business." Wayne reached into his back pocket and took out a long brown leather wallet. He set it on the hood of the Buick and opened it. What happened next was not performed. It was not done for effect. Wayne pulled out a stack of $100 bills, and he began placing them on the black metal of the hood one at a time slowly, because this was money he was giving away, and he was a man who counted what he gave. He placed each bill flat and moved to the next. The paper snapped softly against the hood in the morning air. Fleming sat in the car and counted in his head. Dale Horn stood at the office door with the padlock in his hand and counted. Nora Whitfield stood across the road with her hands on the porch rail and counted with her eyes. Danny Briggs, who had turned around when he heard Wayne's voice at the Buick window, stood at the grease pit and counted. Roy watched through the office window. 12, 14, 17. The bills accumulated on the hood in a neat stack, each one placed without ceremony, without the slightest suggestion that Wayne was doing anything other than counting to make sure the number came out right. On the 15th bill, something happened to Arthur Fleming. He had spent 20 years in banking learning to read numbers rather than faces. It had served him well. Numbers did not have expressions, and they did not ask you to account for yourself. And they did not put you in the position of having to explain decisions that were in the final analysis institutional rather than personal. He was good at his job precisely because he had become fluent in numbers and had let the other language atrophy. But in the car on the way from Holbrook that morning, he had read Roy's letter. He had read it at his desk, and he had understood it completely. The 8 days, the diner work, the calculation behind the request. And he had folded it and put it in the file and driven to Tucumcari because the home office had been pressing for 4 weeks and the quarter was ending and property resolutions affected his performance review. And those were the facts as they existed in the institutional language he had trained himself to speak. He had told himself on the drive that this was not a personal matter. Sitting in the car now, watching John Wayne place $100 bills on the hood of his Buick, Fleming heard his own voice from that morning saying, "I know." And he understood for the first time in his professional life that there was a difference between a decision being institutional and a decision being right, and that he had spent 20 years using one to avoid thinking about the other. The feeling that came with that understanding was not remorse exactly. It was something more specific and harder to manage. It was shame of the variety that comes not from doing something cruel, but from doing something indifferent, when indifference was a choice. 21, 22, 23. Wayne pushed the stack toward the open gap at the top of the window. He said 2,300 even. Write him a receipt, paid in full. Today, right now, standing here. Fleming looked up at Wayne for the first time. He had recognized the voice on Bill 15. The face confirmed it. Something in the closed professional expression he had maintained for 20 years came loose at the edges. Not much, just enough to show what was underneath it. "Wayne said, sir." Fleming turned the engine off. He got out of the car. He walked around to the trunk and opened it and lifted out a small black briefcase. He set the briefcase on the hood beside the stack of bills and opened it. Inside was a pad of First National Bank of Holbrook letterhead, a fountain pen, a glass ink bottle, and a small brass stamp with a red ink pad. He uncapped the pen. He wrote the date. September 18th, 1959. He wrote Roy Briggs' full name and the address of the station. He wrote the amount $2,300. He wrote paid in full mortgage current through April of 1960. He signed his name in full. He pressed the brass stamp onto the red pad and brought it down onto the paper. with the particular deliberateness of a man who knows that what he is doing cannot be undone. The smell of the red ink came off the paper into the dry, hot air. Wayne looked at the receipt for a moment. Then he said, "Give it to him." Fleming picked up the receipt. He walked across the apron past Horn in the doorway and into the office. He set the receipt on the counter beside Roy's cold coffee. He did not look at Roy when he set it down. He set it down the way you set down something that belongs to someone else when you have been holding it too long carefully and without drama. Then he turned and walked out. Outside, Wayne was folding his wallet back into his pocket. He looked at Horn. He said, "Sheriff, drive home." Horn looked down at the padlock. 31 times. He had used it 31 times. He put it in his coat pocket and then changed his mind and walked to the county car and put it on the seat. He got in and drove east on Route 66 toward the courthouse. Without looking back, Fleming reached his car. He opened the driver's door. Before he got in, he looked at Wayne across the roof of the Buick and said, in a voice below the register of anything the open air could carry more than a few feet, "You do not understand the pressure from Holbrook. They wanted this property." Wayne looked at him for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then he said, "I don't have any interest in Holbrook." Fleming got in his car and drove west. Roy came out of the office with the receipt in his hand. He stopped at the edge of the apron. He read it. He looked at Wayne. He read it again. He read it a third time. And after the third time, he did not look up right away, but stood there with the paper between his hands and the September light on his face, and his mouth slightly open the way a man's mouth opens when he has arrived at the edge of something and does not yet know if the ground continues on the other side. Danny came across from the grease pit. Roy held the receipt out to him without speaking. Danny took it. He read it. He read it twice. Then he looked at Wayne. "Roy said, mister." He stopped. Then he said, "Wayne." He said it with the particular tone of a man who has arrived at a name and does not quite know what to do with it, now that it is in the air between them. "Wayne said your father drove to Albuquerque to see Stagecoach in 1939. 190 miles. Roy said he said it was the best picture he ever saw in his life." Wayne touched the brim of his Stetson. He said he had good taste. "Then this is not a gift." Roy said, "Mr. Wayne." Wayne said it is a loan. $2,300. Pay me back when the road comes around. No interest. No schedule. Send a check to my agent in Encino when you can spare it." He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a small black notebook. He wrote an address on a blank page and tore the page out and held it toward Roy. He said, "Charles Feldman, famous artists, Beverly Hills. Pay it back. That is the only condition." Roy took the page. His hand moved to take it, and the movement was deliberate, controlled. But when the paper touched his fingers, there was a moment. Just a moment when something in his hand let go of the steadiness he had been holding for 4 months. The hand shook once, and then stilled. It was not weakness. It was the physical response of a man whose body has been under a sustained and unreasonable load. And when some small part of that load is suddenly removed, the muscles that have been compensating for it cannot instantly return to neutral. He said, "Mr. Wayne, I will pay you back if it takes the rest of my life." Wayne said, "I know you will." Then he looked past Roy to Danny. He looked at Danny for a moment in the way he had looked at the office earlier, reading what was in front of him directly, and without the overlay of what he expected to find. He said, "That boy of yours, engineering school. Don't let him quit. The country is going to need engineers more than it is going to need movie stars." Danny stood still. He did not know what to say, and so he said nothing, which was the right answer. But something landed in him in that moment that he would not be able to fully articulate for another 6 years. His father had protected a future for him that Danny had not known needed protecting, had held a line under a weight that Danny had not been allowed to see. And this man, this stranger who had stopped for gas and had no reason to do anything except drive on to California, had looked at Danny Briggs at 20 years old and said, "The thing your father held the line for was worth holding the line for." Wayne went to his truck. He opened the door and then paused with his hand on the frame. He leaned back out the window. He said one more thing. Roy stepped closer. Wayne said, "Keep the station running." He put the truck in gear. Then he reached his right hand out the window and took Roy's hand and held it once briefly and firmly, the way two men hold hands when there is nothing left to say, and the saying has all been done. Then he let go. He pulled out onto Route 66 and turned west and drove, and the dust lifted behind the rear tires and hung in the dry September light for a long moment before it settled back down onto the road. Roy stood at the edge of the apron. He stood there while the truck became small on the highway. He stood there after it became a brown shape at the edge of distance. He stood there after the shape was gone, looking at the empty western stretch of Route 66. And he did not move and he did not speak. And his hands were at his sides. And the receipt was still in his left hand. Danny stood a few feet behind him and did not say anything. Nora Whitfield stood across the road on the diner porch. She had watched all of it. She had watched the money on the hood, and the sheriff putting the padlock away, and Fleming carrying the receipt into the office. She had watched Roy come out and read the receipt, and hear the words, "It is a loan," and feel his hand shake once. She had watched Wayne drive away and Roy stand at the edge of the apron, not moving. Years later, when Danny finally asked her to describe what she had seen, she said, "I have watched men cry when they lost things. I have watched them cry when they got things back. I have seen what that looks like. What I saw Roy Briggs do at the edge of that apron on September 18th, 1959, was not either of those things. It was something I do not have a word for. A man standing in his right place finally after a very long time of not being sure the place was still there. I do not have a word for that. I am not sure English has one." Roy stood at the edge of the apron for a long time after the truck was gone. Then he went inside. He went behind the counter and set the receipt and the address note and the two $5 bills on the desk. He sat in the chair. The office was quiet except for the sound of Route 66, the occasional passage of a vehicle heading east or west, carrying people toward things Roy knew nothing about. After a while, he reached down and opened the bottom left drawer of the desk. Inside, under the stack of invoices and the folded road map and the final notice letter from Holbrook, was a small wooden mallet and a folded piece of paper. Roy rested his hand on the mallet. He did not take it out. The bank still had paper on this station. The mortgage was current through April of 1960, which meant there were months and years of payments still ahead. And a man does not pick up a mallet to drive a nail home when the work is not done. But his hand stayed there for a moment on the old wooden handle that Gerald Briggs had left him, with a note that said, "You will understand what I mean when you do it." Roy understood. He closed the drawer. He picked up the address note with Charles Feldman's name on it and read it one more time. Beverly Hills, California. He set it down. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him from the side of the desk and picked up a pen and sat there for a long time, without writing anything, just sitting in the quiet of the office that his father had built with a spade in December of 1934, looking at a blank page and thinking about what it meant to owe something to someone who had refused to make the owing a transaction. Outside, Route 66 ran east and west through the dry September afternoon, carrying the country past his door the way it always had. There were 6 years ahead of him that he did not yet know the shape of. 6 years of mornings before the station opened, and nights after it closed of money orders filled out at the desk, and sent to an address in California of letters coming back from a secretary's hand, acknowledging receipt, without ever offering a word from the man himself. 6 years of not knowing every time he sealed an envelope whether the amount inside was enough, or whether it would ever be enough, or what enough even meant in the context of what had happened on this apron. He did not know any of that yet. He only knew that he had work to do, and that the work had a purpose now that it had not had at 11:50 that morning. He put the cap back on the pen. He stood up. He went to the door of the office and reached out and turned the sign from closed back to open. Then he went to get a fresh pot of coffee started because it was a little past 1 in the afternoon on a Friday on Route 66. And the road was still running and someone was going to stop. The first money order Roy Briggs sent to Beverly Hills was for $40. He filled it out on the evening of November 12, 1959, at the desk in the station office after the pumps went dark and the road outside went quiet. He used a black pen and wrote carefully the way you write when the handwriting matters, and he addressed the envelope to Charles Feldman at Famous Artists Agency on the address he had copied from Wayne's torn notebook page onto a fresh card and kept in the top left drawer where he could find it without looking. He did not write a letter with it. He did not know what to say in a letter, and he thought that the money order said what needed to be said. It said, "I remember." It said, "I am working on it." Those were the only two things that needed saying. Nora Whitfield was closing up the diner when Roy walked across Route 66 to the post office annex at the end of Cedar Street, and she saw him through the diner window with the envelope in his hand. She did not call out to him. She turned back to the counter and finished what she was doing, but she thought about it for a long time afterward. The image of Roy crossing the road alone in the November dark with an envelope addressed to California, and she thought it was one of the most Roy Briggs things she had ever seen. 2 weeks later, a letter came from Famous Artists Agency on gray stationery. It was signed by a woman named Patricia Lyle, who appeared to be a secretary, and it said, "Dear Mr. Briggs, please accept this acknowledgement of your payment of $40 received November 14th. Your account has been noted accordingly." It was 4 lines. It was not from Wayne. Roy read it, folded it in half, and put it in the drawer with the address card. He did not know how many of those letters he would receive over the next 6 years. He did not think about it in those terms. He thought about each month as a unit, as a problem with a specific shape and a specific set of tools available for solving it. And he worked through each one the same way he worked through a difficult repair, completely without borrowing worry from the month after it. In January of 1960, on a Tuesday morning with a light frost on the pump handles, a car slowed on Route 66 and turned onto the apron. Roy looked up from the engine he was working on in the second bay. The car was a company Chevrolet light blue with the Phillips 66 logo on the door panel. Walt Greer was behind the wheel. Roy straightened and came to the bay opening and waited. Greer brought the car to a stop and sat there for a moment with the engine running. He was looking at the apron at the new supplier placard Roy had mounted beside the pump canopy in November. It was a smaller company out of Santa Fe, no corporate logo, just a name and a phone number in painted letters. Greer looked at it for several seconds. Then he looked at Roy standing in the bay opening. Then he looked back at the sign. He did not get out of the car. He did not roll down the window. After a moment, he put the car in gear and pulled out onto Route 66, heading east. And that was the last Roy Briggs ever saw of Walt Greer. No conversation. No acknowledgement. Just a man in a company car reading a sign that told him something he had driven 40 miles to find out and then driving away with the information. Roy watched the car until it rounded the long, gentle curve east of town. Then he went back to work. The snowbirds came through in March and April of 1960. The seasonal migration of older couples in large American sedans, driving east from Arizona and California to escape the summer heat. and Roy worked 14-hour days through the peak of it and sent $60 to Beverly Hills at the end of March. Another letter came from Patricia Lyle on gray stationery. $60 received. Account noted accordingly. In the summer of 1960, Pete Saunders stopped at the station for the first time since April of the previous year. He was driving a newer truck than the one he had been driving, which Roy noticed without commenting on. Saunders said he had just signed a contract to add a third service bay to the mobile station, backed by an additional loan, and that business was good and getting better. Roy said, glad to hear it. Saunders left. Roy stood in the office for a moment after the truck pulled away and thought about what Saunders had just told him, the way you think about the weather, when you know it is going to change, and there is nothing to do about it. But note the signs. The following winter, Roy worked 3 evenings a week at Nora's Diner, washing dishes and restocking inventory, the same arrangement he had described in the letter to Holbrook that Fleming had read and folded and set aside. He did not mention the diner work to Danny in his letters. He mentioned the station, the weather, a carburetor job that had come in from a trucker running overdue on his maintenance, a hawk he had seen sitting on the pump canopy 2 mornings in a row. Danny wrote back every few weeks. He was doing well at New Mexico State. The engineering coursework was hard, and he liked that it was hard, which Roy thought was probably the best thing a young man could say about the thing he had decided to spend his life on. In the spring of 1962, Roy heard from a regular customer that Pete Saunders was liquidating equipment at the mobile station. The third bay had been finished the previous fall, which meant the loan for it was barely a year old. The combination of the new bay loan and the original 1957 loan and the accumulated interest on both had reached a number that the station's income could not support. And the bank that held the paper had made the same decision that First National Bank of Holbrook had made. On September 18, 1959, the property needed to be resolved. Pete Saunders lost the mobile station in May of 1962. Roy did not say anything about this to anyone. He thought about what Pete had said on the apron in April of 1959. The easy, confident certainty of it. Either you go with it or you get left behind. And he thought about what behind had turned out to mean. He was not glad. He felt something closer to the particular sadness of watching a thing you predicted come true, when you would have preferred to have been wrong. Danny Briggs graduated from New Mexico State University with a degree in mechanical engineering on May 19, 1962. Roy drove to Las Cruces alone, 4 hours down and 4 hours back, and he did it without stopping except once for fuel on the highway south of Socorro. He arrived at the university 2 hours before the ceremony and sat in the auditorium in the 4th row from the back. Not the front, because the front rows were for the families that needed to be seen, and Roy Briggs had never needed that. The auditorium filled up around him. Families with cameras. Mothers with handkerchiefs already out. Fathers sitting straight in their best clothes, with the particular expression of men who are proud of something and have no language for it, and are hoping the silence will read correctly from a distance. Roy sat among them and waited. When Danny came across the stage and the dean of the engineering college handed him the diploma and shook his hand, Roy did not applaud. The people around him applauded. The auditorium was full of the sound of it. Roy sat with his hands in his lap and looked at his son, crossing a wooden stage in Las Cruces, New Mexico, in a black gown and a flat cap, the first. Briggs to do that in the history of the family, and he did not make a sound. Afterward, outside in the May light, Danny found him near the parking area. They shook hands, and then Roy put one hand briefly on Danny's shoulder, which was the most demonstrative thing Roy Briggs did with people he loved in public. Danny said, "You did not clap." Roy said, "I was counting." Danny looked at him. He said, "Counting what?" Roy looked at his son for a long moment and then said, "How much I owe and to who?" Danny did not fully understand that answer in May of 1962. He would understand it completely in the spring of 1965. The 3 years between those two moments were the distance between knowing your father is a certain kind of man and knowing precisely what that kind of man costs. Danny went to work for Sandia Laboratories in Albuquerque that fall. In the spring of 1964, he married a woman named Carol Hatch from Las Cruces, a school teacher with a particular quality of patience that Danny later told people reminded him of his father, which Carol said she chose to take as a compliment. Roy drove to Albuquerque for the wedding and sat in the third pew and did not cry. But when Danny and Carol came down the aisle after the ceremony, Roy stood up a fraction of a second before the rest of the row, the involuntary rise of a man whose body responds before his composure can stop it. In the spring of 1963, a car Roy did not recognize pulled onto the apron on a Thursday afternoon. It was a 1960 Buick older than the one from September of 1959, with road miles on it and no particular shine. The man who got out was wearing a plain jacket and no tie, and carrying nothing. He walked to pump one and began to fill the tank himself, which Roy noted because in 1963, most customers at full-service stations waited. Roy came out of the office and looked at the man's face across the roof of the car. Arthur Fleming was 46 years old. He looked like a man who had been through a reorganization and come out the other side lighter in ways that were not entirely voluntary. The Holbrook branch of First National had closed the previous month. Roy had heard part of a consolidation that had taken 4 branches down to 2. They looked at each other across the car. Fleming finished pumping and came around to pay. He put the money on the counter. Roy made change. Fleming took the change and did not move toward the door. He said, looking at the counter rather than at Roy, "First National closed the Holbrook branch last month. I'm on my way to Albuquerque. There is an interview there on Friday." Roy stood behind the counter. He did not speak right away. He thought about September 18th, 1959, about the folder on the counter and the voice reading paid in full like a man reading weather data about the pause at pending sale that Horn had heard, and that Roy had not heard until Horn told him about it months later. He thought about the fact that Fleming had received the letter that morning and had made the decision he had made. He had thought about that fact many times in the years since, not with anger, which had never quite arrived, and not with forgiveness, which implied that what had happened was a personal offense, rather than an institutional one. He had thought about it with the particular clarity of a man who understands that most of the bad things that happen to ordinary people are not the result of malice. They are the result of other ordinary people choosing the easier path when a harder one was available. Roy reached under the counter and took out a notepad. He wrote a name and a phone number on it. He tore the page off and set it on the counter. He said, "Man named Gordon Reeves. He runs a small savings institution on 4th Street in Albuquerque. He was a friend of my wife's family. He was looking for someone with commercial lending experience last time I heard." Fleming looked at the paper. Then he looked at Roy. He said, "Why?" Roy said, "Because it is the right thing to do." Fleming picked up the paper and folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. He said nothing else. He walked out to his car and got in and drove west on Route 66 toward Albuquerque, and Roy never saw him again. Roy stood in the office for a moment after the car left. He was not certain that what he had done was wise. He was certain that it was what his father would have done, and in the absence of a better criterion that was sufficient. In March of 1965, Roy Briggs filled out the 14th money order he had sent to Famous Artists Agency in Beverly Hills. The amount was $110. He sat at the desk on a Tuesday evening and wrote Feldman's name and the Beverly Hills address on the envelope from memory, because after 6 years and 13 previous envelopes, he no longer needed the card in the top left drawer. He sealed it and put a stamp on it and set it on the corner of the desk to mail in the morning. He did not feel finished. He felt the way you feel when you have taken the last step of a long walk, and your body has not yet registered that the ground has leveled off. He sat there for a while in the quiet of the office and listened to Route 66 outside the window, and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest. He mailed the envelope on Wednesday morning. A letter came back from Patricia Lyle 2 weeks later. $110 received. Account noted accordingly. He put it in the drawer with the other 13. Then nothing. A week passed. 2 weeks. 3 weeks. Roy thought about it once briefly, and then decided not to think about it. If the money order had been lost in the mail, he would send another. The address was still in the drawer. 4 weeks after he had mailed the final payment, a thick envelope arrived from California. Not from the famous artist's agency address, from an address in Encino. Roy's name was typed on the front. He received it on a Friday. Nora had been by with coffee that morning early before it arrived, and she had already gone back across the road. Roy was alone in the office when the mail came. He set the thick envelope on the counter and served 2 customers and made a phone call about a parts order. And then at 6 o'clock, when the pumps went dark and the sign went to closed, he sat down at the desk with the envelope in front of him. He opened it carefully. Inside were 14 items. He knew what they were before he spread them out on the desk. The money orders and the single check. All 14. Every payment he had sent since November of 1959. Every one of them still blank on the reverse, unstamped, not processed, never presented to any bank for any amount. 14 pieces of paper that he had filled out at this desk over 6 years and sent across the country in envelopes he had addressed by hand, each one representing a month's worth of the particular effort it takes to pay a debt you chose to carry, even when the carrying was hard. Not one of them had ever been cashed. There was a single sheet of plain white paper in the envelope. It was not on letterhead. It was not signed by Patricia Lyle. The typing was a different weight than the agency letters, a slightly heavier keystroke, the kind you get from a man who learned to type on an older machine and never fully adjusted to newer ones. It said, "Roy, I never cashed any of it. The loan was paid the morning your boy walked across that stage in Las Cruces. Keep the station running. J.W." Roy read it. He set it down on the desk beside the spread of 14 money orders. He looked at what was in front of him for a long time. Outside, Route 66 was quiet in the way it gets quiet on a Friday evening in March, with the last light going off the Tucumcari Mesa to the west, and the neon of the diner across the road just beginning to matter in the dusk. Nora had the counterlights on. Roy could see them through the office window, the pale yellow rectangle of the diner interior, the shape of Nora moving behind the glass. He sat with the 3-sentence letter and understood for the first time what kind of a loan it had actually been. It had not been $2,300. That number had been the shape of it, not the substance. The substance was something harder to quantify, the act of one man refusing to let another man lose the thing he had built his life around on a morning when there was nothing preventing the loss except someone willing to stop it. And then, having stopped it, having watched Roy carry the weight of the repayment for 6 years, returning everything with 3 sentences that said, "The weight was never mine to hold." The payment was made the moment your son walked across that stage. Roy thought about the morning of Danny's graduation, the 4th row from the back, his hands in his lap while everyone else applauded. "I was counting how much I owe and to who." He had not known when he said it that the counting was almost done. He had not known that the man he owed most to had already decided the debt was settled. He opened the bottom left drawer of the desk. He took out the wooden mallet. He unfolded Gerald's note and read it one more time, though he had memorized it years ago. Then he took both items and went outside. He climbed onto the roof of the station office by the side ladder he used when the canopy lights needed replacing. It was full dark now, and the Route 66 traffic had dropped to an occasional set of headlights, moving east or west in the distance. He found the top left corner of the Briggs & Son sign by touch, and by the knowledge of 31 years, and he set the head of the mallet against the nail that Gerald had tacked there in the spring of 1935, and driven home with one clean stroke. The sound carried in the dry night air, short and final. He stood on the roof for a moment afterward, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing in the dark above the station. His father had dug out of frozen ground with a spade in December of 1934, with a mallet in his hand, and the mesa dark against a sky full of stars to the west. And he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something so quiet and settled that he could not have named it without making it smaller than it was. When he came back inside, he sat at the desk and took out 2 pieces of paper. One was Wayne's 3-sentence letter. The other was a piece of paper he had kept folded in the back of the bottom drawer since the fall of 1959, old enough now that the creases had gone soft and one corner had browned slightly. He unfolded it. He had written Dear Danny at the top, and then 2 lines. He had written, I need you to come home. The station needs another hand, and I am not sure I can. Then he had stopped and folded the paper up and put it in the drawer, and never sent it because sending it would have meant asking Danny to abandon the thing that Roy had held a line to protect, and he had been unwilling to do that even at the point when he had been most afraid. He looked at both pieces of paper. The letter he had never sent, the letter that had been sent in return. He thought about what they represented when placed beside each other. The fear he had swallowed in 1959, and the confirmation that the swallowing had been worth it. He burned both of them in the metal ashtray he kept on the corner of the desk. He watched the paper curl and blacken and become nothing, and he did not feel that he was destroying anything. He felt that he was completing something, releasing what had been held so that it did not have to be carried anymore. Roy ran the station for 16 more years after that, until he retired at 74 in 1981. The road changed in those years as it always does. The interstate bypassed Tucumcari's old stretch of Route 66 in stages, pulling traffic away from the surface road and leaving the old highway with the quality of a sentence whose subject had quietly moved on. But the station kept its regulars and its reputation, and the sign above the door that said Briggs & Son kept its nail driven all the way home. On June 11th, 1979, Roy was sitting in the office on a weekday afternoon when the radio announcer read the news. John Wayne, 72 years old, had died that morning at UCLA Medical Center. The cancer had been there for years. Roy reached over and turned the radio off. Then he got up from the desk and went outside. He crossed the apron to the pump island and sat down on the low wooden bench he kept there for customers who wanted to wait in the air. He sat there for a full hour without moving, watching the traffic on Route 66 go past. He did not cry. He sat in the afternoon light on a bench beside pump number 2 on a stretch of highway in New Mexico. And the traffic went by and the hours ticked over. And eventually the light changed the way desert light changes late in the afternoon, going gold, and then amber, and then a deep copper that made the whole flat landscape look like something worth keeping. Nora Whitfield saw him sitting there from across the road. She thought about going over. She decided against it. Some things do not need company, and she had known Roy Briggs long enough to know which ones. When he finally came inside, he made coffee and went back to the desk and opened the top left drawer and took out the address card with Feldman's name on it. Feldman had died in 1968. The agency had gone through several reorganizations. Roy looked at the card for a moment and then placed it back in the drawer and closed it. Some things you keep not because they are still useful, but because they represent a time when they were. Roy Briggs died in April of 1989 at 82 years old in the guest room of Danny and Carol's house in Albuquerque, where he had been living for the 2 years following a small stroke that had made living alone at the station impractical. He died on a Sunday morning, and the circumstances were so close to how Gerald had gone in 1948 that Danny thought about it for years afterward, sitting in a chair, a cup of something warm on the surface beside him, his boots on. Danny Briggs retired from Sandia Laboratories in April of 1992 at 62 years old. He spent the first month of his retirement the way he had known for years he was going to spend it, going through the station. The property had been in the family continuously since 1934. Danny had bought it from Roy in 1965 and signed it back to him the same day as a birthday gift. And Roy had kept the station running and the deed in his name until the year he could no longer work it. And then Danny had been the one to close the bays and padlock the pumps for the last time. He had been putting off going through the contents of the office for 3 years. The way you put off the last part of something because the last part means it is finished. He started with the filing cabinets, then the shelves, then the desk. In the bottom left drawer under the invoice files and the road map, and the final notice letter from First National Bank of Holbrook that Roy had kept there for 30 years, alongside a folded notepad page bearing the address of a man in Beverly Hills. Danny found the wooden mallet. He took it out and held it. He remembered the drawer. He remembered asking about it as a child and being told it was for the sign. Under the mallet was a piece of paper. Danny unfolded it and read Gerald's handwriting, the careful block letters of a man who had written precisely because he had not written often. When the bank has no more paper on this station, take this mallet up to the sign and drive the nail in the top left corner all the way home. I only tacked it in 1934 because you were too small to hold the mallet. By the time you read this, you will be big enough. You will understand what I mean when you do it. Danny put the mallet down carefully. He went outside and looked up at the sign above the office door. The nail in the top left corner was driven flush with the wood sunk all the way in the way a nail looks when it has been put there permanently. His father had done it. He had understood. In the back of the center drawer beside the address card and behind the 14 acknowledgement letters from Patricia Lyle at Famous Artists, Danny found something he had not known existed. It was a photograph, black and white, 3 inches by 4, slightly curved from having been stored flat for 33 years. He turned it over. On the back, in Ruth's handwriting, the date September 18th, 1959. The photograph showed the pump island of the station. At pump number 2, 2 men were standing beside a dusty red pickup. One of them was Roy Briggs at 52 in his station clothes with the receipt still in his left hand. The other man was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a tan Stetson, and his right hand was resting on Roy's shoulder. Neither of them was looking at each other. They were both looking at the camera directly with the particular expression of men who had not asked to be photographed and were not sure how they felt about it. Danny was in the background of the image near the grease pit, with a wrench in his hand. He was slightly out of focus. He had not known the photograph was being taken. He sat down on the office chair and held the photograph for a long time. Then he called Nora Whitfield. She was 77 years old and still living 2 blocks from where her parents' diner had been on the north side of what had been Route 66, before the interstate had made it a secondary road. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Danny," said Nora, "I found a photograph in Pop's desk, black and white. September 18th, 1959. Do you know about it?" There was a silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who does not know. The silence of someone deciding how long they have been waiting for a particular question. She said, "I was standing on the porch across the road when your mother took it. She handed me the camera first and asked me to take it. And then she changed her mind and took it back." I watched her take it. Then I went inside because I thought it was something that should happen without an audience. Danny said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Nora said, "Because it wasn't my story to tell Danny. Your father never told it. So I didn't tell it. For 33 years. She paused. She said, "But I thought somebody would find it eventually. I thought it would be you." In June of 1992, Danny Briggs donated 3 items to the Tucumcari Route 66 Museum on the corner of Route 66 and South 1st Street. The first item was a padlock. It was a heavy iron padlock on a steel chain with Key County stamped on the body, and it had never been used on the door. It was made to close. Dale Horn had given it to Roy in the fall of 1977, 2 years before Horn died, with a handwritten note that said, "This one never found its right door. You hold on to it." The second item was the photograph Ruth Briggs had taken with a Kodak Brownie camera on September 18, 1959. 2 men at pump number 2, neither of them looking at each other. Both looking at the camera as though they were not sure they wanted to be in a photograph. One of them with a hand on the other's shoulder. The third item was a document. A 1-page property transfer contract dated 1965 with 2 signatures, Roy Briggs in black ink and Danny Briggs in blue ballpoint. In the left margin in Roy's careful handwriting were 2 lines. Ode to John Wayne. Paid in full by the man himself. September 18, 1959. The museum placed all 3 items in a glass case beneath the south window of the main gallery. Every afternoon at around 3 o'clock, the light that comes through that window in the particular way desert light comes through south-facing windows reaches the case and illuminates the padlock and the photograph and the contract for approximately 20 minutes. Then the angle shifts and the light moves onto the wall behind it. The placard beside the case reads, "Donated by Thomas W. Briggs, in memory of his father, Roy Wallace, Briggs 1907 to 1989, and a stranger who stopped for gas." Nora Whitfield came to the museum the afternoon the display was installed. She stood in front of the case for a long time, looking at the photograph she had watched Ruth take on a Friday morning 33 years before. Then she turned to Danny, who was standing beside her. She said, 33 years I never told that story to a single person. Not because I promised anyone, just because it wasn't mine." Danny said, "It's yours now, Nora." She looked at the photograph again. Roy and the tall man in the Stetson, the hand on the shoulder, the direct look at the camera. Neither of them smiling. She said, "Your mother had the good sense to get the camera out before the moment was over. I never thought to do it. I was too busy watching." There is a receipt from September 18, 1959, that did not make it into the museum case. Roy Briggs used it to line the bottom of the desk's center drawer underneath the invoice files where it sat for 30 years, absorbing the particular atmosphere of a working station office. Oil coffee, the metallic trace of old paper, the slow accretion of ordinary days. By the time Danny found it in 1992, one corner had gone soft from a coffee spill. Sometime in the early 70s, and the ink was faded enough that the amount required a moment to read. Roy had never framed it, never displayed it. He had kept it where he could reach it without reaching for it in the drawer. He opened every day for 30 years, and that was the only monument it needed. There are things a man builds with his hands, and there are things a man builds with his patience. And there are things a man builds by simply not stopping when stopping would have been easier, and no one would have blamed him for it. The Briggs & Son sign on Route 66 in Tucumcari, New Mexico, carried all 3 kinds of building in it, in the wood Gerald had cut, and the paint Roy had refreshed, and the nail in the top left corner that had been driven home on an evening in March of 1965, by a man who had finally run out of paper to owe. Some debts cannot be settled in money. The ones that change you cannot. They can only be answered in the currency of what you do with the time that comes after them, in the decisions you make at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the envelopes you address by hand, and the boys you send back to school when sending them back costs you something real. John Wayne knew that. He knew it on the morning he put a stack of $100 bills on the hood of a Buick on Route 66 and refused every cent of it back. He knew that what he was offering was not a transaction. It was a direction. A signal that said the thing you are holding on to is worth holding on to. Don't let the number be the reason you let go. Roy Briggs kept the station running until he was 74 years old. He drove the nail home when the time came. He sent every payment he had promised to send knowing none of it would be cashed, because a promise made to a man who trusted you is not conditional on what the man does with it. That is the kind of man the desert makes when the desert is given enough time, patient, prepared to wait, certain that the ground under his feet is worth defending even when defending it is quiet, even when nobody is watching, even when the road goes still and the pumps go dark, and the only sound is the wind coming down off the mesa, and the occasional vehicle moving through in the night, carrying strangers toward places he will never know. The light comes through the south window of the Tucumcari Route 66 Museum every afternoon at 3 o'clock, and for 20 minutes it lands on a padlock and a photograph and 2 signatures on a piece of paper. Then it moves on the way. Light always moves on, looking for the next thing that deserves to be seen.